And that actually does make things very interesting because it's a little bit less of a stagnant scene in that sense. People sometimes are a little bit more varied in the playstyles that we see.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what makes TVT the most interesting, right? Is that variety that comes into it as we're loaded in. And in the bottom left position, we have the blue Terran player. He is Vindicta.
And up here in the top right-hand side of the map, we have the red Terran player. He is Epic. Represents Psystorm Gaming. All right. Tell me a bit about that variety you were talking about, Nate, because, you know, variety is the slice of life.
I couldn't agree any more, Fear Dragon. As far as openers in TVT go, you usually see what looks about to be the same on both sides. A gas, barracks, take the other gas, and you're usually getting your factory up before your natural, unless you're very, very confident in your strategy and your plan. So Epic, not having taken that and sending the SCV scout system, he's like, okay, I'm going to do a regular Reaper expand. This is not super strong against some of the more aggressive builds or aggressive cheeses if you're not super on top of it, but he doesn't expect to be cheesed by Vindicta is what this tells me. He feels like he'll be totally fine and safe to do a Reaper. Vindicta, on the other hand, going for the more traditional opener at this point, which is that double gas. And usually once you have both of those gases fully set up and your factory starts, you see some Terrans pull a few workers off so that they can get the mineral income back for the expansion. But as far as the variety that you're talking about, from that point, we see everything. I mean, you've got Raven openers, you've got Cyclone openers, there are tank rushes with medevacs, there are Reaper Hellion rushes with medevacs, there's Reaper Hellion with the proxy starport for Liberators. There's all sorts of crazy things that we've seen over the years. And the thing that makes TVT such a stressful and difficult matchup oftentimes is just the fact that you have to consider all of those options because they're all good. They're all strong. It's all about being able to stay on top of what your opponent wants to do with that early game and then follow up as best you can. Oxide is a map where you can get choked up into your natural and your main very easily by siege tanks. And siege tank pushes are already strong in TVT. So for me, that's going to be the biggest thing to keep your eyes on. If we see those tanks start up early, if we see that transition into the reactored starport, perhaps we could be seeing them gear up for that 2-base push to try and get the contain on the other player.
Yeah, I think all of that actually makes a lot of sense. And if we are talking about some of those mid-game pushes and everything, but I do actually think perspective-wise about these players, and I feel like both of them are sort of a little bit more on the macro-oriented side, especially Epic. I would actually say Epic is the kind of player that I feel like one of his weaknesses has been that he doesn't cheese very often. He doesn't throw in a lot of, not just like, you know, proxy 2-racks and stuff, but I think he also oftentimes doesn't throw out that many like 1-base builds or 1-base all-ins in that sense. So I like a lot of the stuff that you were talking about with some of those kind of pressures that we might see or those move outs on 2 or 3 bases. And I feel like that's probably the direction we're going to be going, as we already see a 3rd CC. I think, no, okay, sorry. Just the natural expansion command center for Vindicta still finishing up over there. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see a 3rd CC come out from one of these players in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah, and it's usually like a flow in that sort of way that the player who goes for the gas first, well, oftentimes, or the double gas first, excuse me, will oftentimes get that 3rd CC a little bit faster versus a Reaper expanding player because they're like, okay, you got the natural faster than me, but my tech is set up so I can make the investment into the 3rd command center a little bit earlier. Unless it's about trying to squeeze in like an early 2nd barracks so that you can do a sort of fast marine stim timing or move out, which it does seem to be possibly on the table from Epic. His stim is very well along. His Reaper gets inside, and what he sees is exactly what you expect in a normal TVT. If you're playing on the ladder, you send that Reaper, and you're like, okay, he's got the Tech Lab starport. He's obviously going to build a Raven. That's like the most normal thing you can do. Banshees are usually not as popular just because Ravens and Cyclones as openers are so popular. But the way that Epic has set this up, he wanted to get that economy set early so that he could do a very quick bio attack that units like Cyclones and Ravens are not going to be super strong against. You know, Marines, they don't worry about Cyclones. You're not kiting bio with Cyclones and microing that. They're very vulnerable to those sort of attacks. And if he gets over to this base and it's just a Cyclone and a Viking and a Raven versus 8 Marines, or he has that 2nd medevac with it, then this gets really difficult to deal with. If he's able to unload all of these inside the main base of Vindicta, He could do almost game-ending damage depending on where Vindicta's siege tank is.
Yeah, I'm also interested to see how that Raven's going to be involved in this. If he spots out this medevac, he can even throw in an interference matrix to either prevent the medevacs from loading back up or something along those lines. But the SCV is going down very, very quickly over here. Even the Cyclone gets pretty low. The auto turret thrown down very far back in this. Now, one of the medevacs has already fallen. A second medevac getting very low. That Viking wants one more shot. It is not going to be able to get it, it looks like.
Use the boost.
Wow.
Boost. Keep going. I don't know why you leave it there. Keep moving. That's not a good place to park. Just because you managed to escape the collapsing, exploding building in Batman or whatever does not mean that you then chill outside. I think if you can keep running, you do. So whatever. Maybe that medevac gets home one day. Maybe it doesn't. And there's the third command center for Vindicta now coming in. But that's kind of what I was talking about. He wanted to go for this early attack. In TVT, killing a couple workers like that in the early game is nice, but it's not like he killed 10 drones in a TVZ or something like that. You know, it's a lot about gas income for the important units early on, especially since we know Vindicta's a mech player. So for him, this is kind of one of those hazards of the job when you play mech, is that people will try to get the bio out even faster into your base, but he gets the scout on the other side. He knows what he's up against from Epic. And now for Epic, even though he killed those workers, rule number one versus mech is it's never over.
Yeah, only got a little bit of Hellion harassment over here, getting surprising amount of damage. It was just supposed to be a scout, I think, but my God, he's up to 4 workers, soon to be 5, maybe 6 soon as well. And Epic is kind of busy just microing around his drops, and is finally going to clean up that Hellion. Oh my God, just the 2 Hellions separated from each other managed to get 6 worker kills.
Yeah, and that's a good amount to be able to get in this situation. The advantages of having the bio out this soon too. He gets his combat shields really early, so he can eat a tank shot a little bit more easily. But then, of course, he just jumps up into the main base. Like, oh yeah, you want to stop the siege at the third? Ooh. Okay, I'm coming in. And even if he cleans this up, he's going to kill Marines, maybe a few medevacs in exchange for the energy on his Ravens, possibly a Viking. If the Marines kill one of the Ravens here, that's huge. You want to remove those power units, especially the Ravens. And that was actually pretty well held by Vindicta in that situation. He cleared that out. He didn't lose too much of what he had that mattered. His Vikings will land and clean up this tank. And now he gets his third base up. So the longer that the game goes on, the better for Vindicta, because those siege tanks will always be good against the Marines. But the Marines will not always be good against the tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we do end up in a situation where those Ravens not having any energy, like you were saying, they've kind of been effectively removed from any potential push-outs or defenses for a little bit. It will eventually get back some of that energy, but it kind of gives Epic a bit of time that he knows he's not likely to just get attacked or pushed into for a little bit. So having a very quick 4th base in that kind of bottom right-hand side, or I guess like the center right-hand side, is a kind of interesting decision. It's going to actually be pretty difficult to punish that. And I don't actually usually feel like I see that location taken as the 4th base that often.
Yeah, I think he's just feeling a little bit of pressure now because like I was saying with that attack, if he's able to get those Marines in, take the energy, kill 1 or 2 of those expensive units, he got the Cyclone, but he lost 3 medevacs, and he pretty much just got the Raven energy there. The Marines weren't able to kill Vikings or Ravens on the way out, so he still has the anti-air presence. He still has the neutralization capabilities of the Ravens, because they're going to get some of the energy back. It's not like he took out the Vikings once the Marines were in and the medevacs died, and now he can do a big doom drop. He still has to play this carefully because the tank count has not been affected in a meaningful manner. So the bio, as soon as there's 3 or more, especially once you're at 4 or 5 tanks, you're not just rushing your Marines straight into them unless you're super maxed out and you can afford to rebuild your whole entire army and just, bludgeon the mech player to death. But that's how you play mech. That's the whole point of it, is for your opponent to try to bludgeon you to death. And then when you're looking at the game clock at 10 minutes, the supply is even, which is awesome for the mech player. Your supply is way more valuable. In TVT, tanks and Vikings decide pretty much every single game, even if it's bio versus bio. If you go watch the last VOD, you think you're like, oh yeah, only mech players do this. No, literally every TVT that goes long has to eventually boil down to, there's so many tanks, you can't break the base with just bio, so you need to get air control. You have to get the Liberators with the range, and then that starts the Viking Wars. So there's a very delicate balance there, and I think if you're Epic, you're now realizing that this game has to go mega late. Yeah, he's starting the extra starport, so I think he realizes what is happening in this match.
Yeah, it's always a tough watch though to see a Terran player that is so far behind on the air superiority control game that they are 10 Vikings behind and they're trying to play catch up from here. I feel like it does take a little bit of time unless you're able to build those starports, get at them on the reactors. I guess it's going to only be 2 rounds, but oh my god, those Vikings knocking that medevac out of the sky. Easy win over there for Vindicta, and he's just continuing to be this solid wall of mech that doesn't really look like it has a lot of openings.
Yeah, you know, like I said, he did it beautifully. The attacks that came into his base, if you're fighting a mech player, honestly, your last priority should be like, oh yeah, I'm going to try and drop and kill workers, because they almost don't matter. You have mules, and really everything that is mech is limited by gas. There's nothing good you're building with just minerals other than extra command centers and maybe missile turrets if your opponent is going air. And we can see Vindicta, a classic thing that happens when you're playing bio is you're out on the map, you're like, oh yeah, I'm doing this, he can't do a whole lot. Then that one Liberator slips in and you're like, oh, I lost a few minerals or I lost a few workers. And losing the mineral income actually does hurt the bio player a little bit more because their best unit is really just minerals. So you're spending your gas on upgrades and some of these tech units, but that also is a part of how the game eventually just turns into both players just massing Vikings and siege tanks, which is that's where we are. That's where we're at. 6 Vikings at a time, 1-1 coming in for Epic, and we've got Ravens dropping auto turrets on a planetary. Yeah, I guess if the energy's maxed out, you know, you might as well use a little bit of it, but I'm not sure if you want to use too much, because that also opens supply for the Terran to have more Marines. You actually want the bio player to have a silly amount of workers so that they can't overwhelm your tanks, so you can more easily transition into something like battle cruisers or make your big move out, because with mech, you're pretty much usually just pushing once, unless it's one of the greatest games ever.
Well, we already see that it looks like the Liberator able to siege up on top of some of these siege tanks, and now we see the Marines starting to stem on forward. Some of the siege tanks unsieged, but a decent number of them getting taken on out. The Viking war absolutely favoring Vindicta, not only with the Vikings, but even the Thors getting into the mix. And while the Bioforces did take out a lot of tanks there of Vindicta, we absolutely can see very easily that Epic is the one that loses far more supply in that trade.
Yeah, and this is what makes it difficult. So as a bio player, you want to have an established economic advantage off the back of the early mid-game phase. The whole advantage of bio versus mech, it's not like Marines and Marauders are better than tanks. If you run equal supply into each other at 100 plus, the tanks are going to obliterate everything. So what you have to do is establish that economic lead with your map control and make the transition into the army that beats whatever the final mech army is supposed to be. And you just want to be able to decisively trounce it with a huge economic lead. So the fact that Vindicta's been able to get all these bases up at a similar pace to Epic, it removes that option from the table, and he's just kind of left building inferior units. Now we see him starting to add barracks again because he's realizing, okay, maybe I need to go all over the place. I need to prepare to catch this army in the middle of the map rather than drag it out. But you know, the Vindicta plays like he's played a bajillion mech TVT games on NA ladder, which is to say that he's looking quite unbreakable at the moment.
Yeah, he's looking pretty good, and all of Epic's attempts to do this drop harassment or do little run-bys and stuff has been shut down. Vindicta has been all over it. Now with the sensor towers that have been set up on basically covering the half of the map that actually matters to him, he's looking to be in a great position. Epic starting to remax out a little bit, but even his Liberators are getting taken out. He is finding a favorable Viking trade over here. Thor only going to be so useful as a lot of siege tanks going to get sieged up by the Liberators, and Vikings kind of coming in one by one over here for Vindicta, but he is eventually starting to win out on that war. And my God, another really good engagement at the end of that for Vindicta.
Yeah, it's a pretty big, it's like a common fallacy with discussion of TVT strategy and about the Thors and which mode they should be in. You're like, oh, splash against the Vikings, but the damage output really isn't there. And having that extra range off the single target Thors makes it really easy to just click on the Liberator, boom, it's dead. And then the only thing they can do is land the Vikings, and that only works when there's nothing else to really support the siege tank. So Epic gets left in this really awkward spot where now he's the one being sieged. He's behind on the supply. He's going to become behind on the income from the damage that these bases are taking. And also, I mean, a decent amount of his production is right there in front of the tanks too. So those are going to be units he just can't build anymore in a little bit.
This is getting tougher and tougher. It feels like Epic is gradually starting to bleed out a little bit. He has a Liberty Siege up over here, at least slowing down a command center from building, but a Thor takes it on out. Now Epic does have a serious lead on the Viking count, but the Thor is still just trading out so well. Finding that extra little bit of damage over there is at least going to keep Epic a bit in check, and Epic is, I mean, his back is literally up against the wall. It's not usually a good spot for the bio player to just have an entire army sitting at his front door and feeling like you can't escape anymore.
Did you say his back's up against the wall because of the camera? Is that it, Fear Dragon? He's technically in a corner as well from that perspective, which he is. The planetary fortress is getting sieged up on. The Liberators are pre-sieged there. Epic's trying to build a ton of them, but the problem is if he can't deal with the Thors, they're going to bully the Vikings away. If you want to try to land the Vikings on the Thors, it's only going to work if you have like 50 of them. And even then, you're asking for a lot because this is a full mech army. So he doesn't really have anything that can push this away. He's just getting these little picks here and there with the Liberators when the tanks and the Vikings aren't in position. But he could move. I mean, he could move those Thors up and click on that Liberator that's hitting his tanks. It's not like there's 6 siege tanks defending the ground over here for Epic.
Yeah, I think even as the Liberators try and siege up in, I mean, they do a lot of damage to these Thors, and now the Marauders also coming on forward, all pairing together. It finally does act as a bit of a cleanup here, but is an expensive cleanup, Nate.
Yeah, he did get him. So he built 6 Liberators. He was building 6 Libs at once and just wanted to siege all of them at the same time. So that the Thors, the one weakness of the Thor in this situation is they are chonks. So when you're trying to move 3 Thors down a ramp, if you check the VOD or the replay on this one of those 3 Thors was actually just derping behind the other 2. The Thor has a lot of range, but you do have to scooch up a little bit if they're not all in a straight line. So you didn't quite have the full DPS of that, and it made it a lot easier for the Liberators to punch through that, even without much ground support. But Vindicta still maintains a huge supply gap. He's got another expansion on the left side. He's got another orbital finishing up. His Hellions are able to harass freely now. And it's just going from bad to worse for Epic. He needs to get a jump on the army, unsiege in the middle of the map. But that usually works when you're maxed out and ahead by 20 supply, because that's normally what's supposed to happen in a bio versus mech game. But when it goes this long, it actually just turns into mech versus mech is really what it is. And the mech player is usually just ahead because they were upgrading a lot earlier. There's not a tremendous amount of air support here, though, as all of the Liberators siege at the same time. So he needs to make sure he's focused firing the Liberators, and he's mostly hitting the Vikings there. So as they finally kill the Liberators, the Vikings land. Vikings are amazing, by the way, against mech, just because they do double damage to mechanical units when they're landed. Fun fact, Terran buildings are also mechanical, so if you're able to even get a little hit squad of those in their base, you can blow up add-ons and depots faster than you'd be willing to believe.
Well, Vikings are definitely holding their own over here for a while in favor of Epic, but again, it's always at a cost. Every single time, Nate, there's 2 Vikings in this back line, taking out his entire mineral line. He's continuously losing workers. He's continuously losing bases. It just feels like no matter what wins Epic keeps getting in these fights with his Vikings or his Liberators, every single time Vindicta just has more where it came from, and he's losing the war of attrition at this point.
Yeah, that's the biggest problem, is these guys are trading, and it's not like Epic is unable to do anything about it. He's taken some good fights. He's cleared 1 or 2 of these armies, but the hard part is that he's not replenishing what he's losing remotely as fast as the other player, and that's what really makes it tough. That one Liberator in the back, by the way, both Thors couldn't shoot it at the same time again, so it made it a little bit tricky to clear, but now the next wave shows up, and that's what happens when you can't build as much as the other guy. The reinforcements end up tilting things in favor, and that was just a really well, cleanly played game by Vindicta. Picks up game 1. Probably the biggest thing to note, Epic's strategy, from my perspective at least, as analyzing it, looked like, I'm going to do a really fast bio drop to try to punish your slow ramp up of a mech build. And Vindicta just had all of his pieces in the right place. He killed 3 medevacs, didn't really lose much there, lost 10 workers to the Marines. Guys, I'm not joking when I tell you, if you kill 10 workers in TVT at like 6 minutes in, against a mech player, it's basically meaningless unless you're also able to get a tank or get one of their Ravens or get one of those expensive units that take a while to build, because once he hits that number that he needs, yeah, no, losing 100 minerals a minute of income isn't going to mean anything to a guy that's completely capped by his gas income.
Yeah, that is also one just the tough things I think about TVT is trying to find the ways that you're going to be able to get the damage done is maybe not just the exact same as the traditional game of StarCraft and a lot of the other matchups. So very important that you prioritize those targets. And it seems like Alex, or I should say Epic, is going to have another opportunity moving into game number 2, where he's going to have a chance to try and make something happen. But I do want to actually really quickly bring it back to some of that group math I was talking about. Epic could have guaranteed his advancement in the group if he had won 2-0. Now that he's down 0-1, it already starts to get complicated. He can still advance out with a 2-1, but he is now counting on, I think it is Trigger to lose his match. And well, I think that actually Masa is apparently up 1-0 versus Trigger. So maybe not the worst thing to hope for.
Maybe there's still a little bit of hope there. I mean, as you said, it's still going to be a 2-1 in order for that result to help him in the way that he's hoping that it will. But yeah, it makes things interesting here, because the amount of TVT that Vindicta's had in this group, his TVT mech play is reasonably solid. It's not like there's a huge hole in there. He's playing the very standard builds. He's not doing anything that's outside the ordinary. Double gas first is very normal. Reaper Hellion, Raven, Cyclone. These are just like the standard check off the box TVT things. What Epic did was, I'm going to rush to try to attack you and damage you. But because he did that rather than investing into, say, like a faster third command center or earlier Ravens, he takes away his own opportunity to use those power units, and instead makes just kind of like a half-assed attack that just didn't really do a whole lot for him. So going into game number 2, I hope that if he brings that early pressure, it's actually more aggressive. Bring a little bit more, invest a little bit more into that first push, because against a mech player, it really needs to do more than what he accomplished in game 1. In the Northeast, representing Psystorm Gaming, he is Epic.
And down here in the bottom left-hand side of the map, we have the blue Terran player from Alpha X. He is Vindicta, sitting up 1-0. Also, I actually do have, I think, some interesting-ish updates, I would say. Looking at the other group standings, so we did get word of some fun developments. Scarlet apparently playing Protoss right now versus Namshar.
Why am I not surprised?
Up 1-0, yeah. Another one is that, as I already mentioned, Masa is currently up 1-0 versus Trigger. And Neep also up 1-0 versus Jon Snow, according to Liquipedia. Now, I'm not sure if this is the case. We have a document that lists all the scores, and this could just be a mistake. But it does say that Jon Snow and Neeb are tied 1-1. That could just be a mistake. It could be incorrect.
Maybe meme build him? Maybe just a meme build, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes believing that nothing can work is exactly the motivation you need to make it work.
I like that. I like that train of thought. I'll investigate and see what's going on with that, because I think we have a pretty normal looking opening yet again from these two players.
Yeah, it's another Reaper expand by Epic. So we're going to probably see the slightly faster third out of Vindicta here, depending on which way he wants to go. After a game like that, just being super blunt, there's really no reason for Vindicta to change up the game plan. Epic threw himself at him, failed, and then Vindicta's the rest of the game, he just kind of coasted through. He didn't lose anything that mattered early, so he was always able to deal with the drops past that. Those Vikings cleared up the medevacs like we were talking about. He had plenty of tanks to defend the third. When he tried to flank on that high ground by the fourth, he still had tanks there. And I'm not crazy about bringing Thors in a large number into those late game TVT air fights, but having one or two, which he didn't go super hard on it. He never really had more than like 2 or 3 Thors in a fight at once, which I think is important to keep in mind, because they do end up blocking each other, and they have diminishing returns because of that, since those fights happen so quickly. So he had a really good Viking count. To me, that's the most important thing in TVT. If you have control of the sky, you can deny the vision for the opponent's tanks. You can deny the drops. And of course, you can deny those Liberators and the Vikings trying to land on top of your units. And that's really what I think gives mech such a late game strength these days, is because you just start building Vikings earlier than the other guy.
Yeah, one of the things that always does come up when you talk about things like mech and everything is it can be one of those styles that is pretty heavily affected by matchups. As I say, all of that, we actually do see these Reapers getting a pretty decent trades over here for Vindicta. So ends up losing one of his Reapers there and his Hellion, but manages to get a Marine and another Reaper, some scouting information and stuff. But yeah, I was going to ask you, Nate, how do you feel about 2000 atmospheres for that kind of mech style?
Well, I think about this map is you don't have, it's not all ramps all the way out. So something like those two base pushes can still be strong, even if it's not as much of a choky map as Oxide, but you still have the ability to kind of sneak around the side of that natural and try to blow the front door down or get control of where that main base ramp is and some of the production. This Reaper for Vindicta, by the way, is being incredibly annoying. Gets a good amount of random harass shots off and sees just about everything. So Epic, by the way, in this game, kind of just went back into that 1-1-1 with the third CC rather than going for the fast bio attack, which I think is the correct move here. Giving yourself those Ravens and those tanks and those Vikings earlier in the game is going to generate insane value. It's almost never bad to have that set up. And then you can move into the bio and get the stim and try to make a bigger attack, but a little bit later than he did in the first game.
Yeah, absolutely. Just wanted to do one quick update because I did go check on it. Jon Snow Neeb actually is tied up 1-1. So our Lord and Savior, the Titan of North America, Neeb, finally getting taken to an ace match versus Jon Snow, who I don't know if I don't think Jon Snow has ever defeated Neeb before. That'd be pretty cool.
Ever?
I actually think he's literally never defeated Neeb before.
Are you sure they've never done like rock, paper, scissors for a tab or something like that?
No,
I've
also seen Neeb. I know I've seen Neeb beat Jon Snow in rock, paper, scissors before for like deciding where they were going to go eat. Okay, sorry. There was one match when Neeb used to play Terran back in 2015. Jon Snow won that one.
That's not literally all of them forever, Fear Dragon. You've lost my trust. You've lost my trust. I'm just messing with you. That's funny though. Hasn't beaten him since he played Terran is perhaps a better headline though. I think you'll get more clicks on that. From whether from happy or angry people. Look at this though. These types of setups are really interesting. Vindicta going on the aggressive with that fast tank over towards the base, and I think he was hoping that it would be more of an early bio focus, that he could try to get this wedge position. But this Epic has to jump on this right now, or this will get real bad.
Yeah, does manage to get the interference matrix off on one of those siege tanks, which really does shut down a lot of the firepower for that entrapment right there. But Dream Marine's up on the high ground, and the Raven even joining in with an auto turret. Maybe gonna be able to snipe off a siege tank over here. Doesn't quite have what it takes. He chases down that siege tank with the medevac, takes it out. Takes out even more units over here. I mean, this is actually just getting a surprising amount of damage. Another Raven shows up with another auto turret. I don't think that one's going to be able to get too much more, but really, really impressive amounts of damage there. At the end of the day, though, was it all worth it? I think Vindicta lost a lot of units in the process, too.
Yeah, the most interesting thing about that was that he lost that first Raven. And I think when you drop the auto turret by the tank, it could be that he just has it all in one control group and he's trying to do his macro at home and it's a little bit hard. This is kind of the speed of the game that we're just talking about. But if he had kept that first Raven alive and then you've got two building up energy, because he killed Epic's first Raven with the auto turret and the Marines. That was the first thing that happened. So he took out a very important piece. He does still have one of his Ravens, which is nice. I'd love to see him repair that along with the medevac. But when we talk about what the goal of the mech player is, which is to just reach that maxed out army that's basically unkillable if you control it properly, damaging the bio player early in any way like that is huge, because every second he buys for himself to get the gases on the natural, to take that third base, to get the armories spinning, that is a second that Epic cannot afford to give him, especially with how it played out in the first game.
Well, we got another little attempt at doing some harassment over here from Vindicta, but man, Epic is super on top of this one. Ready to intercept. I don't even know if there's going to be much of an escape mechanism over here. Oh,
photos taken before tragedy. There you go. Goodbye, medevac. Goodbye, Marines. Well, it's not like he needed the Marines, really, right? I guess at this point.
That is true.
Unfortunate.
There is that fun vulnerability period that you can try to exploit, where a Terran player is still building up their mech army, and I feel like Vindicta has been throwing a lot of these things at Epic, and all of them have kind of not been working out super well. Is there now this little window where the factories are still being made and Epic is going to be able to make something happen with both his force on the north and the south pushing in?
And this is another big moment. You need to get some damage done to these mech players early on before they can establish multiple tanks and start to have a little bit of mineral bank and build up those turrets so that you can't just drop through them and drag the whole army back. As long as the mech player doesn't have to unsiege their tanks that are outside their expansions, they're happy. You just don't want to get forced to pull everything back home to stop a doom drop. And that's really got to be the #1 fear that most players have. So he comes in with a double medevac towards the natural. That army outside the third wasn't really able to do a whole lot. He gets one of these tanks, interference matrix, and knocks out one of the medevacs. I think he's going to get that second one on the way out. But he's just going to lose a sensor tower for that. And at the end of the day, he's still building his tank count up. He's still getting the extra infrastructure. These are the most important things to keep our eyes on. A little bit of a supply block, though. That's not very cash money, Fear Dragon.
Yeah, Nate, I'm not gonna lie. Those trades, that was a little funny to watch. Hellions walking right past the Bioforce, but I was gonna say those trades are not going the way that Epic wanted them to, as he ends up losing quite a few units there without it really accomplishing a whole lot of anything. He is still sieged up outside of Vindicta's third base, but not a whole lot happening with it. He is maybe just keeping some units over there as he tries to push in again, but look at that tank line. It's not going to be easy to break that tank line. I do not think this Bioforce can really do anything to just stem up and take out that tank line very easily.
It's only going to get more difficult too, Ravi. It's only going to get more difficult. You know, one of my favorite meme things is, as you know, the game has changed over the years, but when they made that big tank buff to the damage that it does, you're pretty much always two-shotting Marines or Marauders. The upgrades largely affect, you know, like Splash, or if the bio stims a little bit and they have +3 armor sort of thing. But you don't have that same pressure on you. So you can afford to get into the factories a little bit more heavily earlier on. He's building 5 Hellions. He was building 5 Hellions at a time for that cycle, which was a little bit interesting. But I guess that was for the Liberators because he just wants to dislodge these tanks off of him. But it really only takes a couple tanks to do the job. And that Liberator is going to force these Vikings to come back. He's denied mining from the natural of Epic for a huge amount of time. But here's the big drop. Swings around that third base. He's dead inside the main base. There's just a couple of Hellions. The Liberator's coming back. And there were 2 tanks that had been into the natural that are coming up. So I think he should be able to clear this out. He's going to lose the Raven. I'm not sure that these medevacs are going to be able to escape though, Fear Dragon. So this is where Epic needs to get a bunch of big blows in. He is going to clear out a few of the tanks from by where he would be looking to get that 4th. This is what we're talking about. Epic's got a huge supply lead right now. This is exactly what you're looking for. You want to trade your army away, but you also want to make sure you're killing their army when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, he is doing a good job trading and finding these siege tanks that aren't protected by anything else, just because all the units are being drawn over to the main base and everything. A very nice attempt at that doom drop over there. He is, again, like you were saying, trading out a lot of his own army supply, but there's going to be a very funny moment now where Epic has actually +2/+1 before any of the mech upgrades have actually finished up, and he's starting to move on forward. Maybe he's going to attack in. No, that is actually a very well defended position now. I think he's going to have to find another angle, and oh, he does, over by the third base.
Yeah, this is a nice spot to be able to get. This is what happens when you force those units to reposition, when you force those tanks to move around. The mech player has an idea in their mind of where they need the tanks to be, but they don't always necessarily get them back to those same spots after you're forcing them to run all over the place. And dropping units directly on, chipping away at that tank count, it prevents the investment from being able to be made into the huge starport plays. And then you don't have these turrets because you don't have your 4th base up when you needed to, and you're losing. And it's just this compounding 1, 2, 3. And now Epic looks to be in a good spot, but Vindicta is still striking back. He's still bringing that harass in and being as annoying as he can be, because if he's able to secure this base, it's still going to be 4 base versus 4 base. It's not over for him. The 5th has started in the top. That command center just booted up for Epic. But, Vindicta, he's still at 144 supply. If he maxes out, he doesn't need to have a bank playing mech.
Okay, here we go. We're starting to see more and more of this army coming forward from Epic, ready to make this big push in over here. Now, the attack on the top left-hand side was cleaned up, so this is going to be a singular position for that pressure. But the Viking count for Epic is dominating right now the skies, even with a bit of that Thor's DPS. And now that you have air superiority, a lot of gates start opening up. A lot of ways to start finding opportunities and openings to pressure in start making themselves very visible.
Now these Hellions trying to do a little bit of damage. It's always tricky with the planetary to get just outside the range of it for the harass. We could see building range for Epic to take that off the table. That just about makes it quite hard to sneak those Hellions in the back, but he's got his Liberator clearinghouse. And our observer showing us, very importantly, thank you, y'all, the Viking count is a huge problem, though. If he cannot get some turrets, if he cannot secure this position, 19 Vikings to just 2, one Thor does not stop all of this. There's really not enough tanks. If he brings everything to this base, this is the hard part about the situation that Epic caused. And these extra tanks coming over are going to help, but that reposition is where Epic says, okay, you're moving more tanks to that base? That's great. Now I'm going to move my whole entire army to your other base. That's how you break the mech play. You need to press 100% of the pressure onto one point so that it just crumbles and shatters. If you spread the pressure out, the mech build is designed to be able to sustain that weight like a bridge.
Yeah, and we're starting to see that as Vindicta is getting pushed further and further apart from the bottom to the top side, these Thors pretty much the only, and it's funny to call Thors mobile components, but they're at least more mobile than the siege tanks that are having to continuously siege and unsiege and maneuver around. Liberator is already sieging on up, gonna prevent these Thors from getting a whole lot closer, and they're gonna start taking out these siege tanks as well.
Yeah, these Liberators are doing amazing work because it's just the Thors. And the thing is, you can only pack so many of them into these spots. But the spread on the Thors makes it a little bit easier. You can see they're landing more of the hits. But as the Liberator count scales up, you can stack like 20 of those things in one hex if you want. So you can't do that with the Thors. That's why the Vikings become really important again. But Vindicta with some Liberator counter harass, I love this. He's being so annoying for a guy boxed into his own base. And he's got that max out of supply now. It's a lot of Thors, which won't be as good against the bio, which won't be as good against the tanks, but it kind of invalidates a lot of Epic's air units because you can't just fly the Vikings over and land them on the tanks when there's 8 Thors sitting there.
Yeah, they'll be taking a lot of damage in that process. A lot of those missile turrets you were talking about are finally coming on up, and Epic is starting to look to rotate around maybe as, whoa, Vindicta is literally just going to be walking past this army and going across the map with a very slow Thor parade push. Oh my God. This is going to get a little bit wonky very soon. Surely Epic's wondering now as he scans everywhere to see where this army is. Tell me he saw it. Tell me he saw that the army is basically at his front door right now.
Oh boy. The weird thing about this is if you run back to try and defend, you're going to run into a million tanks that are sieged up on your own base. And that's really hard to break, right? But it's more of a Thor-based army in this situation. So it's like, how do you approach this? You have to siege the Liberators all at once. You have to try and land the Vikings on top of this army while the Liberators are sieging and bring in the bio. And that's exactly what he does. Brings in everything all at once to swoop down on this army because he had to leverage so much of his supply into the Thors. And that's why we meme about, you know, TVT, tank Viking wars and all that. Epic definitely lost a lot to make that happen. But when you reset the mech army, well, let's face it, it's a whole lot easier to rebuild Marines and Marauders than it is to build tanks and Thors. The fact that Vindicta is researching Magfield and getting Cyclones kind of speaks to the urgency of the moment. He needs units out as fast as he can get them. Those Cyclones don't build, you know, they don't take quite as much time as those tanks. So if he can squeeze a few of those out, and they also provide some anti-air.
Yeah, this is also going to become a problem where Vindicta really doesn't have the affordance to spread out his army as much as you were talking about before. So if Epic is able to find a way to hit in, you know, different locations or at least pull his opponent's army apart, it's going to maybe be a little bit easier than it was back when Vindicta was maxed out. But time is kind of the essence for that sort of strategy, right? And we're already seeing that supply is getting higher and higher for Vindicta. He's already actually just diverting a lot of the attention away for Epic because he finds more and more of these worker kills. Epic is down to just 42 workers at this point.
Yeah, it's a very awkward situation because that's what TVT is. It's the dance. All TVTs that go long eventually turn into it's big about the air control. We know that the tanks can sustain and defend these planetary fortresses. Everybody knows that. If you've ever played Versus Terran, I'm sure you've lost a game angrily because you tried to attack one of these bases and they're freaking unkillable. But that's what the air support and the control is all about. I mean, if these Vikings, even on their own, are able to slip around some of the areas where the anti-air isn't as strong and go for a big land, that can be huge. It is nice to see the Cyclones get their value, though, on the defense here. A lot more mobile than the Thors.
Yes, they are. Well, I'm seeing a little bit of a standoff over here as this one siege tank wails away at some of the static defense. And Epic still poaching around for an opportunity to move on in, but the mech army is not too far behind. A lot of Hellions being added in to just buffer for some of those initial hits against the Bioforces as well. And we're seeing that Epic is still just struggling to find opportunity. Vindicta is maxed out again. Liberators are going to siege on up and try and buy a little bit of space. Forces quite a bit of this army back while the Bioforce darts on down and finds finally a big vulnerability here in that base.
Yeah, this is a good point to be able to grab all the Liberators are sieged up on top of the ramp. Even if the bio gets largely clean, you can still use the Vikings to try and pick off the infrastructure there, isolate some of these units like the Thors. There is the Vikings. They land in a ring around it. Maybe a little bit unnecessarily flashy since those Thors are probably going to die anyway, but gets the job done. And the zone control of this space is just amazing because if those Liberators can keep that spot, he did kind of get a path to retreat to his natural, but I was going to say he's able to get on top of the production. This is always going to be the most important. That's like your win condition versus Terran. He wasn't able to do it with a full army, so he's going to get cleaned up. He's not going to kill all the factories, which is kind of like almost a GG moment. But man, this game has just been really, really intense because honestly, I thought he was going to get way more of his army inside the main, but Vindicta cleaned that up way better than I expected.
Yeah, he actually manages to trade out decently well. Doesn't lose as much of production as I thought he would, even though he does lose a few add-ons here and there. Widow Mines actually blanking quite a bit of the army. A lot of the Liberators also getting softened up, which makes it easier for these Vikings to take their pot shots and snipe them off. Epic at least holds the line with a couple of the Marauders backing up this army. I want to note how many of those medevacs just died, though, as well, because remember, we have only a limited supply of those medevacs out on the map since so much of the starport production time has been focused on Vikings. So 7 medevacs being produced right now in one massive wave to replenish that supply before I imagine going back into a bit of that Viking focus.
That's the to me, that's the hardest part about trying to play bio versus mech in these situations is at some point you're going to have to go back to building some of your Marines and Marauders because your army is really slow and generally behind on like the regular mech upgrades, which aren't always the biggest deal because the damage is so huge. The upgrades don't have the same implications in TVT that they do in the other matchups because you're still pretty much two-shotting almost everything that's walking into your face. So getting the bio out, if you don't have those medevacs, well, that's a supply that doesn't fight for you, but everything that the mech player has is going to deal damage, and that's part of how these armies become so hard to break.
Okay, we're starting to see Epic pushing into a massive concave of Siege Tanks and Liberators. And yes, he's taking out a few units, but he's losing a vast majority of his own. Oh, that felt like a disastrous engagement right there for Epic.
Yeah, that's when you tried to push up the ramp. The tanks were there. I actually really like the Widow Mines. Even though most of them died sprinting towards the army, they ate a lot of valuable shots from those Liberators, from those Marauders that could have otherwise gone onto the tanks that were sieging up. So anything as a buffer here is great. But that's what I was saying. The medevacs, yeah, he rebuilt them, but they don't deal with anything here. They don't really do anything other than let the Marines maybe survive an extra hit sometimes. So Vindicta's huge maxed out mech army continues to march down. I don't see a path to victory at this point for Epic. Once he gets on top of the production, he's going to kill possibly 3 orbitals here. And if he kills these supply depots, he might not even be able to build anything. Not that he could really afford to rebuild a whole lot of this anyway, but he's got mines under the Liberators. Mines do actually kill the Liberators, so I guess that's something to smile about. But Vindicta just played a pretty stupidly clean series of TVT mech here, Fear Dragon, and it's, I don't know, I'm pretty impressed. This was a very well done setup by him. He's still producing. He's still maxed out. He's still taking bases. He's got the gold base in the northwest, the purple gas base rather. So I don't know. There's not really a whole lot left to say. He's getting on top of Epic's production now.
There it is. GG. Vindicta is going to take the 2-0 victory.